My name is Godfrey Chama, and I work for UNICEF Lesotho as a social protection specialist. I'm going to be talking about the key steps that are required when setting up a program MIS or an integrated system for information management under social protection. One of the key issues of building a broad consensus among key stakeholders is the fundamental agreement on the broad design and parameters for a program management information system or an integrated system for information management and the underlying databases that bring about the integration. It is quite easy to commission complex systems that don't respond to a country's needs and that we're not able to manage. We are now going to talk about the key questions that need to be asked when conducting a needs assessment, as well as the key feasibility parameters that need to be taken into consideration in this entire process. When looking at a needs assessment, we have to ask ourselves some key questions, such as when it comes to building components around the broad social protection context and the policy issues and legislation, we have to ask ourselves, what is the national social policy which is in place? What are its priorities? Does this policy actually reflect the plans for integration? And how is this going to be done? We need to look at the issues that have to do with stakeholder mapping, because the social protection process has a number of stakeholders. We need to ask ourselves, who is in charge? Who is going to be delivering other aspects of social assistance and social security in the country at both national and the district level? That is at both central and decentralized levels. This includes all people in the rural areas who constitute the primary users. We also need to ask ourselves what other stakeholders are involved, and these are mostly secondary users, and they could be sister UN agencies or other non-government organizations. In looking at which further actors may have a stake interest, we normally talk to as many potential stakeholders as possible to establish those who have an interest. And also, we have to establish what resistance could be encountered, because social protection systems are essentially human systems. One of the other key questions that we have to ask ourselves is, what are the legislative foundations for social protection and for integration that are existing in a country? The legislative framework is quite important because it is the one which puts in place the legal basis on which social protection can be conducted by government. We need to understand what the current degree of fragmentation or integration within the social assistance and between the social assistance and social insurance programs is. And then we also have to establish what the existing mechanisms for both horizontal and vertical coordination of these programs is. And they also ascertain the different levels of decentralization and the capacity to deliver at a local level. Now, all this occurs within the broad context of social policy. But another component that we need to always look at is the broad e-governance context. And this looks at the state of readiness of the e-governance platform within government. Does government have a wide area network? Does it have institutional arrangements? Is there a government ICT framework that guides interoperability to enable computerized information systems to be used? We also need to look at the legal and the regulatory components in the same breadth as looking at the existence of other information systems which are transversal to government. Such systems include the existence of a national ID system, the civil registry for linkage in determining who the citizens are, and the other forms of ID which can be derived from the taxi identification systems. So apart from that, We also have to ask ourselves whether there is any existing programs and any other business processes that can be brought into the context of setting up a program MIS. And we need to ask ourselves, what are these programs and where are they, in which ministries? Are these ministries related to the ministry responsible for social protection or not? And we would also need to establish whether it is necessary to integrate these programs within the broad program MIS program. And they also establish whether the programs have any current business processes and or would require any redesigning or integration, and how this can be done to ensure that they are part and parcel of the program MIS, so that then we can determine whether the program MIS is integrated or virtually and socially integrated to suit the information requirements that we would be looking at. Now, when it comes to information requirements, there are also specific questions that have to be asked. And these are, what are the specific information needs of all the actors that are involved? We could have a lot of data, but data will only become useful if the information is able, if we are able to use the information for the purposes for which it is intended under the social protection systems. So we then need to understand carefully, when we are collecting data, what kind of data is needed to feed into the core business processes that would be used in the management information systems. And also of most importance, and lastly, would have to ask ourselves whether the amount of data that has been collected has been limited by keeping it focused on the core objectives and processes of the system to constitute it into for use as information that can now be applied to ensuring that social protection information is used for both payment purposes, for measurement, for targeting, and for management information purposes within a specific ministry. Now, I'll highlight which questions need to be asked in a feasibility assessment covering the following components. That is institutional capacity, implementation capacity, infrastructure requirements, financial costs and sustainability, intended users, potential positive impacts, potential negative impacts, and conclusions and recommendations around social protection systems. The first component is institutional capacity. The kind of questions which have to be asked around institutional capacity is whether there is existing legislation and policy which adequately reflects the rationale and the main objective that is being pursued. If not, we need to ask ourselves whether there is space for shifting policy in this direction and how this can be done. We also have to ask ourselves whether there is strong enough political leadership advocating for reform and coordinating institutional actors across the board. If not, then we need to establish how this can be garnered. We also have to investigate whether other institutions will back the processes, and these are normally stakeholder institutions. We have to establish who will oppose it and how each of these can be influenced and brought on board. We also need to establish if there is sufficient capacity to identify and cost potential options for integration purposes. This might require assessing the affordability and the identification of available financing options. If these are not available, then we have to ask ourselves how this technical support can be achieved using our partners or development partners or other stakeholders. Lastly, we have to ask ourselves if the existing governance structure is strong enough to ensure vertical and horizontal coordination, and whether this can lead to developments and management phases that are sustainable. If this doesn't exist, then we have to establish how it can be strengthened. The second component is the implementation capacity. When looking at the implementation capacity, we have to establish what capacity is available at all levels of the social protection governance and how this can be implemented on such a project. We have to ask ourselves what the gaps are and what needs to be addressed in terms of numbers and qualifications of staff that are supposed to be carrying out this function. We have to establish if there is in-house IT capacity and if this can be leveraged to support the implementation of the program MIS. If the IT capacity is in place, we have to creatively design how this will be used. And if it is not in place, we need to source external providers and establish how they will be managed to deliver the implementation capacity. We also have to establish if there's an existing network of staff at both local and the central, local, and district level, and how these can most effectively be used in country. Overall, we have to establish what the proposed roles and responsibilities of the various actors are supposed to be, and what their involvement is going to be in setting up, managing, and using the proposed social protection program MIS. The third component is composed of infrastructure requirements. This is composed of two elements, and these are what the hardware requirements of the proposed program MIS model are, and whether these respond to the country's constraints and durability as examples. We need to find out whether they are already available at all levels of governance and whether they will be needed or whether they will be procured. In the other instances, we could require business process reengineering within to get these resources streamlined so that they can be optimally used from different departments within the existing ministry. But in doing so, we need to carefully establish how it is going to be done and what the expected costs are. The second element of the infrastructure requirements revolves around the telecommunication systems and network, which is necessary for ensuring that the program MIS is working. For this to work, we need to ensure that it is responding to the country's constraints and that there is available internet and power infrastructure to ensure that the systems can be used, and also to ensure that the systems are always available by putting in place backup options that ensure that there is no loss of service at any one time. The fourth component is looking at financial costs and sustainability. In looking at this, we have to determine what the estimated startup costs are and what the proposed model is going to be and how expensive it's going to be, taking into account both the hardware and training costs. We also have to look at the estimated costs of operating the proposed model, because this would have an impact on overall sustainability. And this would also include the staff requirements and any other hidden costs. The fifth element involves intended users, and this is focused on how the system will ultimately be used and whether it will require any other enhancements to enable its full utilization. The sixth element revolves around the potential negative impacts. These have to be identified and isolated as they can have an impact on the overall implementation of the system. For example, some of the mitigating factors might include privacy and security risks, excessive costs, unsustainability, and the weather partners or the political situation in the country. Lastly, to conclude and to come up with some recommendations, we have to identify any viable conclusions that can benefit the program MIS, which might not have been mentioned here. To conclude, I hope you've enjoyed my explanation of the requirements for implementation of the program MIS. Thank you very much.